a strange place for the U.S. to have a military base. Set up after the Spanish-American War in 1903, the U.S. has paid about $4,000 in rent to the Cuban government annually. Until recently, it was a little-known outpost, but after 9/11, the U.S. government adopted a policy that would shock the rest of the world.
Guantanamo Bay was chosen as the place where the administration wanted to hold people that they picked up in the war on terrorism, no matter where they picked them up, from Afghanistan or Pakistan or Bosnia or anywhere else. And they really went around and they looked, where can we hold people and not be subject to court review or any legal restrictions?
In Guantanamo, the U.S. government insists that the men held are not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention, since they're not prisoners of war, that they weren't combatants of a state power. And yet, by the same token, the government argues that they're not entitled to the protections of constitutional laws because they're not held on American territory.
The administration chose Guantanamo as an island outside the sovereignty of the United States, but subject to our exclusive control. And they did that for the specific purpose of avoiding the law, avoiding all the rules, the Geneva Conventions, our Constitution.
By creating this sort of label of terrorist, unlawful enemy combatant, they're trying to use sort of propaganda on why we shouldn't care about them, why we shouldn't ensure due process for them, and kind of sacrifice our values as Americans that we've held so high.
BBC reporter Vivian White was allowed to audiotape his visit to a place that had been previously off-limits to all journalists.
I'm walking now along a line of cells, which are 8-foot by 8-foot metal grids. We're deep inside Camp Delta. I can now see a group of men dressed in white, in T-shirts. These are detainees. They were just a few feet away, the other side of the wire, and one of them then spoke to all of us in English.
All of us thought, when we started hearing about Guantanamo, that the people that were going there were people that were fighting for the Taliban, that were part of Al-Qaeda. And there probably are a lot of people there that aren't very nice. But what we quickly learned from groups that were permitted to go in and to do civil rights and human rights assessments is that there were people there that really didn't belong there. Because the battlefield in Afghanistan was everywhere and anywhere. And so that meant that anyone who was in and around was subject to being brought in.
Whether they were fighting for Al-Qaeda or fighting for the Taliban, as the military suggests, or whether they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, picked up by a bounty hunter who wanted to claim a reward that the military was giving out for bringing in Al-Qaeda people.
There were men that were well into their 80s that were brought into this net, and there were children. This wasn't just people that were soldiers on the field.
Mozam Beg is a British national whose family says he was installing wells in Afghanistan and teaching in Pakistan until shortly after 9/11.
I received a telephone call from my son. He said, "Dad, I've been arrested." And I said, "What? Why?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Who has arrested you?" He says, "Americans, and I don't know where they're taking me." And the line was disconnected.
For over a month after his arrest, his family had no idea of his whereabouts. Finally, they received a letter. He had been taken to Guantanamo Bay.
Everything about these detentions is designed to render these human beings into this state of total dependence on the United States military. They're held in solitary, they're manacled when pulled out for interrogation, they're interrogated at great length, they can't reach out to anybody, they can't call a lawyer, they can't call their families. These people are entirely at the mercy of the military with no end in sight to their detention, and not surprisingly, there have been suicide attempts.
At last count, more than 30 of the Guantanamo Bay detainees had tried to kill themselves.
We don't hear about that anymore because the government no longer reports suicide attempts.
Begg's family had no understanding of the graveness of his circumstances. The few letters they did get from him avoided details altogether.
In fact, he was trying to avoid everything because I had bypass operation and I was not well enough. So he was not writing anything clear to me. After a year, I wrote to him that I'm very well, there is nothing wrong with me. Then, in response to that letter, he wrote me a letter saying that I'm pleased that you're well. Pleased to know that you can do all the activities, but my position is different. I haven't seen moon, sun, or natural light for the last 1 year, except 2 minutes. I've been kept like an animal in a cage. They don't give me food. They don't give me water. My clothes are torn. Where are my human rights? There is no one to help me. That's why I'm writing you. So please help me if you can. That letter actually tore me apart. I didn't know what to do. Straight away got in touch with Foreign Office. They said we don't have any access. Americans won't allow us to go there, so we do not know anything about him. If we hear, we will let you know. They never ever did anything.
What Beg's father is asking for his son is specifically guaranteed in tenets of international law. He wants an impartial trial.
If he is guilty, he should be punished. If he is not guilty, why should be there?
The United States has refused to abide by the Geneva Conventions. They are the rules of war that were developed after World War II. Basically, what they say is when you capture people during a war, you have to treat them humanely. You have to give them medical assistance. You have to, first of all, decide who they are. You know, they get this right to this tribunal that decides, are you a prisoner of war? Are you a civilian? Do you have nothing to do with this whatsoever?
In lieu of a trial, President Bush has declared that certain of the Guantanamo detainees, Mosam Beg among them, will be subjected to a military tribunal.
There is no presumption of innocence in this process because to even go to a military commission, you have to be presumed to be a terrorist. And they're using that as justification to lower the standards of justice that we're used to in this country.
President Bush has already let it be known how he feels about these people.
Now, the only thing I know for certain is that these are bad people. And we look forward to working closely with the Blair government to deal with the issue.
The White House counsel, Alberto Gonzales, advised the president to ignore the Geneva Conventions at Guantanamo. He said the Geneva Conventions are obsolete and quaint and shouldn't govern the way that we need to question prisoners there. Secondly, he said, it's a good thing from our standpoint if you say the Geneva Conventions don't apply, because under U.S. law, violations of the Geneva Conventions can be prosecuted as war crimes. So we could be prosecuted for war crimes for not following them, but if we say they don't apply, then we have an excuse to say that we can't be prosecuted. We have heard recently that there are allegations of what we've seen at Abu Ghraib really occurred at Guantanamo as well. And we know that General Miller, who was in charge of Guantanamo and now is in charge of Iraq, said that he could violate the Geneva Conventions at Guantanamo.
One of the real concerns when we treat others like this in the name of fighting a war is that others fighting us can treat our soldiers like this.
We're setting the standard under which we're going to say it's okay to do this to our service members. It's okay for North Korea to capture a U.S. citizen and label them an unlawful enemy combatant and try them in our same system where some Army general is making all the decisions, and he appoints a panel of just his Army officers to be the judge and jury.
When Donald Rumsfeld was asked how long can these people be held, he said, as long as the war on terrorism lasts. Then they asked him, when will we know when the war on terrorism is over? He said, when there are no longer any terrorist organizations of potentially global reach left in the world. Now, all of us have potentially global reach today, and we're never going to eliminate political violence from the face of the earth. So what he's essentially saying is that we can hold these people forever, without ever charging them with anything, without ever giving them a hearing of any kind.
Congress shall have the power to declare war and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Locked up indefinitely? No lawyer? No trial? If you think this can't happen to an American citizen, think again.
We have disrupted an unfolding terrorist plot to attack the United States by exploding a radioactive dirty bomb.
I get a phone call in the car. The prosecutor calls up. He says, your client was taken by the military. And I thought they were joking.
Thank you, but no comment at this time.
Newman's client, Jose Padilla, had been held as a material witness for an entire month before Ashcroft's dramatic announcement. He had been charged with no crime, but was seen as someone who could provide information to a grand jury about 9/11. Suddenly, he was being called a terrorist.
We know that Abdullah al-Mujahir is an al-Qaeda operative.
Broadcasting live from Moscow, Ashcroft announced the arrest as if Padilla had just been caught and a terrorist act narrowly averted.
Let me be clear. We know from multiple independent and corroborating sources.
Nothing had happened from the time of his arrest 4 weeks before till his designation. And the information that they had was the same. So one has to think, okay, so then what changed?
And I wanted to point out to Director Mueller that
just prior to Ashcroft's announcement, FBI whistleblower Colleen Rowley had been appearing before Congress. She was testifying about the lack of intelligence sharing between the FBI and CIA and how they'd bungled the warnings that might have prevented 9/11.
We need to streamline the FBI's bureaucracy in order to more effectively combat terrorism.
Let me just start off by saying
now Rowley's issues seem passé, as the Justice Department kept emphasizing that interagency collaboration had led to Padilla's capture and the country saved from a terrorist attack.
Was a result of the close cooperative work of FBI agents and CIA agents.
Close cooperation among U.S. government agencies.
But what had all this cooperation yielded?
Within hours, 24 hours, the government then had news conferences in which they backtracked. They said, well, it wasn't really a plot, it was just like in the talking stages.
I want to emphasize again, there was not an actual plan.
There were discussions about this possible plan, and it was in the discussion stage.
It certainly wasn't at the point of having a specific target.
What's remarkable is when you read the government's papers is that they insist that the government does not have to charge Mr. Padilla with a crime.
They don't really have any evidence of any crime. They have a notion that he might have met with people from al-Qaeda, but they don't think he's a member, and they've said so in court papers.
So what was the sudden urgency? The cynical among us might believe it was to deflect Rowley's damaging information. The government wasn't saying. And with Padilla now locked up in solitary confinement in a naval brig in South Carolina, he wasn't able to explain anything either. Some information about Padilla began to surface. As a teenager in Chicago, Padilla's involvement in a murder committed by an older gang member landed him in juvenile detention. He later moved to Florida, and when he was 21, he went to prison for 10 months after firing a gun into the air during an argument. Upon his release, he converted to the Islamic faith at a center known for preaching nonviolence. Over the next 10 years, his only run-ins with the law were for minor traffic violations. His new religion would take him to the Middle East, where he married his second wife. On a return trip to the United States, he was taken into custody.
Mr. Padilla was arrested at Chicago O'Hare Airport. He was initially detained under the material witness statute, and only after they could no longer hold him under that statute did they then label him as an enemy combatant.
Padilla's activities and his association with al-Qaeda make him an enemy combatant.
An enemy combatant? Where did you make up that term? I really had never heard of it.
I thought the administration's rules on military tribunals said they would be only for non-American citizens. Is the whole point of holding him as a military combatant to be able to question him without using conventional criminal process?
His status, as the Attorney General said in his statement, is as an enemy combatant. He is being detained under the laws of war as an enemy combatant.
And if the president labels them an enemy combatant, or in President Bush's words, a bad guy, they can be held indefinitely, incommunicado, without a hearing, without charges.
Congress has already ruled on this. Congress said, you can't ever use our military for domestic law enforcement purposes. We don't want you doing that. We don't want you to use the military to arrest citizens. We don't want martial law. And this president and this attorney general says, I don't have to follow the rules.
Does he have legal representation at the moment?
He was being held under the authority of a federal judge, and he had legal representation in connection with that, yes.
Larry, how far did they get?
I called the Department of Defense. I even called the White House. I got the response. He will not be able to call me. I will not be able to call him. I will not be able to visit him. And while, of course, I can write to him, they would not guarantee that he would receive my mail.
Although the government now claims that Padilla may have been involved in a plot to blow up apartment buildings, they have provided no evidence, nor charged him with a crime.
The detention of an American citizen indefinitely without counsel is based not only on hearsay, could be triple hearsay for all we know, but they admit that one of the individuals who gave the information has lied to them in the past, has his own agenda for giving information, and the other informant, in quotes, recanted.
We've never in the history of the United States had investigative detention. We don't do that, except now we do.
Recently, the Supreme Court decided that enemy combatants such as the Guantanamo prisoners and Jose Padilla have the right to an attorney and access to a court of law. It remains to be seen how the government will comply with this ruling. The accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial and be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. The Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Every step of the way, we've heard John Ashcroft tell the public, trust us, we're the government. And yet he refuses to release important information that the public needs in order to understand what's at stake.
Government claims of secrecy can rightfully be viewed with suspicion.
And the secret, as we have learned in history, generally, it's they're hiding their lack of evidence. Korematsu is a perfect example. Korematsu is when the Japanese were interned based on the government's allegation that these people were dangerous and had to be put in internment camps indefinitely until the war was over. Subsequently, after the war, everybody now knows that the information that the government gave to the court was false. They misled the court on purpose. And the rest of the information, of course, they said is secret. And the secret was, we don't have anything.
In 1953, at the height of the Cold War, the government also misled the Supreme Court in the case of U.S. versus Reynolds. That ruling established the government's right to secrecy if it jeopardized national security. But the Los Angeles Times recently revealed that the government used the national security claim to hide the truth about the Air Force's poor maintenance of a B-29 bomber that crashed, killing 9 people. The national security claim was a lie.
There's a legacy of abuse of these very kinds of powers. We went through the civil rights movement where the FBI and the CIA were investigating the civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, the anti-war protesters, people who were perceived to be the political enemies of the government. This same authority is now vested in the Justice Department by the Patriot Act, and that's a dangerous situation for Americans.
I can't confirm or deny who our client is. I can't confirm or deny some of the arguments that we've made in our legal papers. I can't even talk about the basic facts about what has led the government to try to seal this lawsuit from public review and from public scrutiny. I can't talk about why the government insists that it jeopardizes national security.
The ACLU has challenged some of the unconstitutional clauses present in the Patriot Act, but they have been gagged from even telling the American public what is going on.
Even as the president has made the Patriot Act one of the cornerstones of his re-election campaign, we can't tell the public about the circumstances and facts of our lawsuit challenging a portion of the Patriot Act's constitutionality.
I think that the world is going to be more peaceful and free. Result of this discussion, our fellow citizens have a better understanding of the importance of the Patriot Act and why it needs to be renewed and expanded. The importance of the Patriot Act when it comes to defending America, our liberties, and at the same time that it still protects our liberties under the Constitution.
The public needs to have the facts as it makes its decisions about whether or not the Patriot Act went too far.
The ACLU is not the only organization that has been silenced by the Patriot Act.
If librarians have been approached by the FBI, they of course can't tell you that, because one of the rules in the Patriot Act is that you can't tell, which is terrifying, really.
What it allows the government to do is to come in and subpoena your customer records to find out what books have been checked out or what books they bought. It doesn't allow the bookstore to contact a lawyer to fight it. It's all done through foreign intelligence surveillance court, and doesn't give us an opportunity to stand up for our customers.
At least when you get a subpoena from a local court, because there's reasonable cause to suspect that someone has broken the law and their library records would contribute to the investigation. That's what the law used to be. At least you could tell anybody that you had responded to the subpoena.
And they don't even need reasonable suspicion to obtain records on you. Employment records, medical records, and even banking records.
The government has deputized the banking industry to spy on American consumers. What we see is the possibility that banks, in doing their policing duty for the government, are going to be looking at who we are, finding out more information than they ought to. It's a very profitable place for them because they get to sell information about us. You just wonder, are you giving the wrong people too much authority?
Government agents can now check on who you are sending email to, who you are getting email from, and what websites you visit by claiming it is relevant to an investigation.
It requires no showing that the individual whose records are being sought actually engaged in or had any connection to any kind of terrorist conduct. So it basically makes all of us vulnerable.
When you look at the Patriot Act, you're struck by the fact